In the winter of 1940, the German General Staff ran a series of war games to test the plan for invading the Soviet Union. The results were unsettling. Not because the simulation predicted disaster, not because the numbers were wrong, but because the games revealed something that should have stopped the entire planning process cold. The three army groups, advancing along three separate axes toward three separate objectives, could not support each other. They could not concentrate at a decisive point. They were, from the very first week of the operation, diverging from one another across a front that would eventually stretch more than 1,000 miles. The war game told the planners that the operation, as designed, could not achieve everything it was supposed to achieve, and the response was not to redesign the operation. The response was to assume that the Soviet Union would collapse before the contradictions mattered. That assumption was not stupidity. It was not madness. It was, given what Germany had just experienced in France, arguably rational. And that is precisely what makes the story so unsettling. Because the contradictions in Barbarossa were not hidden in some obscure appendix of a planning document. They were visible from the very beginning. They were visible in the directive that launched the operation. They were visible in the geography of the Eastern Front. They were visible in the three arrows on the map, each pointing toward a different prize, each requiring resources that the others also needed. And yet the operation went forward, because the people designing it believed that the Soviet Union would break so quickly that the contradictions would never have time to matter. They were wrong. And the reasons they were wrong reveal something fundamental about how ideology, ambition, and military planning can interact to produce a strategy that is internally at war with itself. If you find yourself drawn to the question of how intelligent people build plans that contain the seeds of their own failure, the channel is built around exactly that kind of historical investigation. Now, to understand why Barbarossa's objectives contradicted each other, you first have to understand what Germany looked like in the summer of 1941, and you have to resist the temptation to see it as a simple story of hubris, because the situation was genuinely complicated. Germany had conquered most of Western and Central Europe in a little over 2 years. Poland had fallen in September of 1939. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, Yugoslavia, Greece, think defeated. Britain remained at war, but Britain could not project meaningful ground force onto the continent. The United States was rearming, but had not entered the conflict. Germany was, by any conventional measure, the dominant military power in Europe. But dominant is not the same as secure, and this distinction matters enormously. Britain's survival meant the war was not over. The Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic approaches. Strategic bombing, still in its early stages, was beginning to touch German industry. And there was the question of resources. Germany did not have secure access to oil. It did not have secure access to rubber or certain rare metals, or the agricultural surplus it needed to feed both its population and its armies indefinitely. The British blockade, enforced by naval power, meant that Germany's access to global markets was severely constrained. This was the strategic problem that drove everything that followed. Germany was winning wars faster than anyone expected, but it was not winning the peace. It was not building a self-sustaining economic system. It was not ending the broader conflict. And every month that passed, the industrial capacity of its potential enemies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, was growing. So the question facing German leadership in 1940 was not whether to consolidate, the question was whether to strike again, and where. And here is where the contradiction begins to take shape. Because the answer to that question depended entirely on what you believed Germany's fundamental problem actually was. If the problem was Britain, then the solution was to knock Britain out, either through invasion, through submarine warfare, or by destroying Britain's ability to continue fighting by eliminating its last potential continental ally. That last option pointed toward the Soviet Union. If the problem was resources, then the solution was to seize the agricultural lands of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the industrial capacity of Western Russia, that also pointed toward the Soviet Union. If the problem was ideology, if the problem was what Hitler described as Judeo-Bolshevism, then the solution was the destruction of the Soviet state itself. And that obviously pointed toward the Soviet Union. So every strategic logic, every ideological impulse, every economic calculation pointed in the same general direction, east, into Russia. The target was the same, but the objectives were not. And this is the critical distinction that most summaries of Barbarossa miss. The target was the Soviet Union. The objectives were Leningrad, Moscow, and the economic regions of the South. And those three objectives were not three steps toward the same goal. They were three different goals. They required different axes of advance. They required different distributions of force. They required different timelines, and they required, in practice, different political outcomes. Directive 21, the formal operational order for Barbarossa, was signed by Hitler on the 18th of December 1940. It laid out the broad concept. 3 army groups would advance into the Soviet Union. Army Group North would advance through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would advance through Belarus toward Moscow. Army Group South would advance through Ukraine toward the Donetsk Basin and beyond. On a map, this looks like a coordinated plan. 3 arrows, 3 objectives, 1 operation. But look at the geometry. Army Group North is heading northeast. Army Group Center is heading east. Army Group South is heading southeast. From the first day of the advance, the 3 forces are spreading apart. The gaps between them are widening. Their mutual support is diminishing. Every mile they advance, they become more separated, more exposed, more dependent on increasingly long and vulnerable supply lines. This was not an oversight. The General Staff understood the geometry. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, understood it. The Army Group commanders understood it. But the directive reflected Hitler's political and ideological priorities, and those priorities could not be reduced to a single axis of advance without abandoning something he considered essential. Leningrad was not just a city. It was the symbolic birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. Destroying it had ideological significance beyond its military value. It was also a major industrial center and a naval base. Taking it would eliminate the Soviet Baltic Fleet. Moscow was not just a capital. It was the hub of the Soviet rail network. It was the political center of the state. Its capture would, in theory, paralyze Soviet command and control. It was also, practically speaking, where the main body of the Red Army was expected to concentrate for defense. Destroying the Red Army meant fighting toward Moscow. The South was not just territory, it was resources. Ukrainian grain, Donetsk, coal. So ultimately the oil of the Caucasus. Without those resources, Germany could not sustain a long war against Britain and, potentially, the United States. The economic argument for the Southern advance was not ideological. It was practical. It was, in many ways, the most strategically rational objective of the 3. And that is the problem. Each objective was rational. Each objective had genuine strategic logic supporting it. But the 3 rationales were not compatible with each other within the constraints of the available forces, the available time, and the available logistics. You could not achieve all 3 simultaneously. You had to choose. And the plan, in its structure, refused to choose. Now, the German military had a doctrine for dealing with this kind of problem. It was called the Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort. The idea was simple. You concentrate your force at one decisive point. You accept risk elsewhere. You achieve a breakthrough at the Schwerpunkt, and then you exploit it. Everything else is secondary. Everything else supports the main effort. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in Poland. It had worked brilliantly in France. In France, the Schwerpunkt had been the armored thrust through the Ardennes, a single concentrated blow that split the Allied armies in 2. The lesson the German military drew from 1940 was that concentration produced decisive results, that a single focused blow could shatter an enemy's ability to coordinate a defense. Barbarossa did not have a single Schwerpunkt. It had 3. Or rather, it had a shifting Schwerpunkt that moved from one army group to another depending on the phase of the operation, which meant that in practice, no army group ever had the concentrated force necessary to achieve a truly decisive breakthrough against an enemy of the Soviet Union's size and depth. Halder and the General Staff wanted Moscow to be the clear Schwerpunkt. Their reasoning was straightforward. The Red Army would defend Moscow. Therefore, the main body of Soviet forces would be found in front of Moscow. Therefore, the destruction of the Red Army, which was the primary military objective, required the main effort to be directed at Moscow. Everything else was subsidiary. Hitler disagreed. Or rather, Hitler could not bring himself to agree, because for Hitler, the destruction of the Red Army was not the only objective. It was not even necessarily the primary objective. The primary objective was the destruction of the Soviet state as a political and ideological entity, and the economic resources of the South were not subsidiary to that goal. They were central to it. because Germany needed those resources to win the broader war. And Leningrad's destruction was not subsidiary either. It was ideologically necessary. So the plan tried to do everything. And in trying to do everything, it guaranteed that nothing would be done with sufficient force. There is a moment in the planning process that illustrates this perfectly. In early 1941, during the detailed planning conferences, the question arose of how to allocate the armored divisions. Germany had approximately 19 panzer divisions available for Barbarossa. 19. An enemy that fielded more than 300 divisions, with thousands of tanks, across a front of more than 1,000 miles. The question was where to put those 19 divisions. The answer, dictated by the three-objective structure, was to split them. Army Group Center received the largest share, because it was expected to fight the main body of the Red Army. But Army Group North needed armor to drive through the Baltic states, and Army Group South needed armor to break through in Ukraine and exploit the open terrain beyond. The result was that no single army group had the armored mass to achieve the kind of decisive encirclement that had destroyed France. They had enough to win battles. They had enough to encircle Soviet armies in the opening weeks. But they did not have enough to achieve the kind of strategic paralysis that the plan actually required. Because the plan required the Soviet Union to stop functioning as a coherent military entity within 6 to 10 weeks. And that required not just tactical victories, but strategic collapse. And here is where the assumption becomes visible. The assumption that made all of this seem workable. The German leadership believed that the Soviet Union would behave like France in 1940. Or like Poland, that a series of sharp blows in the opening weeks would shatter the enemy's ability to coordinate, that the political structure would crack, that the state would fragment. Hitler reportedly said, in a conversation with his generals, that the Soviet Union was like a rotten structure. You kick in the door, and the whole thing comes crashing down. This was not a random metaphor. It reflected a specific analytical framework. The German assessment of the Soviet Union was based on several observations. The Red Army had performed badly in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 and 1940. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had removed a large percentage of experienced officers. The Soviet political system appeared brittle, held together by terror rather than genuine loyalty. The nationalities within the Soviet Union seemed like potential sources of fragmentation. Each of these observations was, in isolation, factually grounded. The Red Army had indeed struggled in Finland. The purges had indeed gutted the officer corps. The political system was indeed authoritarian and repressive. But the conclusion drawn from these observations, that the Soviet Union would collapse rapidly under military pressure, was not supported by the evidence. It was supported by ideology. And it was supported by the experience of France, which had created a powerful cognitive template. Germany had fought a major European power and defeated it in 6 weeks. The assumption that this could be repeated was not irrational. It was simply wrong. The Soviet Union was not France. It was not Poland. It had strategic depth that neither possessed. It had a population of roughly 190 million people. It had industrial capacity east of the Urals, beyond the reach of German air power. It had a political system that was brutal and repressive, but also capable of mobilizing enormous resources and demanding enormous sacrifice. The terror that held it together was also a mechanism of control that made fragmentation less likely, not more. But in 1941, this deeper analysis was not the dominant framework. The dominant framework was the French campaign. And the French campaign said that speed, surprise, and concentrated armored force would produce strategic paralysis. So the plan for Barbarossa was built around that expectation, 6 to 10 weeks. Destroy the Red Army west of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers. Advance to a line running roughly from Archangel to Astrakhan. The Soviet Union ceases to exist as a military threat. The war in the East is over before autumn. 6 to 10 weeks. That timeline was not an aspiration, it was a strategic necessity. Because Germany did not have the resources for a long war in the East. It did not have the fuel. It did not have the ammunition reserves. It did not have the replacement capacity. The logistics system was designed for a short campaign. The supply depots were stocked for weeks, not months. The transport infrastructure, much of it horse-drawn, was adequate for a rapid advance, but not for a sustained one across continental distances. And this is where the contradictions become truly structural. The plan required a quick victory, because the resources could not sustain a long one. But the objectives required a continental advance that could not be completed quickly. The three separate axes of advance guaranteed that forces would be dispersed. The dispersed forces could not achieve the decisive concentration needed for quick victory. The absence of quick victory meant the logistics system would be stretched beyond its design limits, and the stretched logistics would prevent the forces from achieving their objectives. It was a closed loop of failure, and it was visible in the planning documents. The General Staff's own logistics calculations showed that the supply system could support an advance to roughly the Divina-Demer line and then would need a pause of several weeks to rebuild. Several weeks. In a campaign that was supposed to last 6 to 10 weeks total. The pause was not a contingency. It was a structural feature of the plan. And after the pause, the advance would have to continue with rebuilt supply lines against an enemy that had used the pause to reorganize. But the plan went forward because the alternative was to acknowledge that the objectives were incompatible, that the operation could not achieve everything it was supposed to achieve, and that a choice had to be made. And making a choice meant abandoning one of Hitler's core objectives, and that was politically and ideologically impossible. The invasion began on the 22nd of June, 1941. 3,600,000 Axis troops crossed into the Soviet Union, more than 3,000 aircraft, roughly 3,600 tanks. It was, by any measure, the largest military operation in human history to that point, and in the first days it appeared to be working. The Soviet Air Force was largely destroyed on the ground. Soviet forward units were encircled and destroyed in enormous cauldrons. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. The advance was rapid. The news coming back to Berlin was extraordinary, and for a brief moment, the assumption seemed validated. The rotten structure appeared to be coming down, but even in those first weeks, the contradictions were operating. Army Group Center was achieving spectacular encirclements at Minsk and then at Smolensk. But Army Group North was advancing through terrain that was increasingly difficult, forested, with poor roads, and the armored formations were struggling. Army Group South was facing stiffer resistance than expected, particularly around the old Polish border fortifications, and the advance was slower than planned. The three army groups were not advancing at the same speed, they were not achieving the same results, and because they were advancing in diverging directions, the gaps between them were growing. The flanks were stretching, the supply lines were lengthening, and the enemy, battered but not destroyed, was falling back rather than collapsing. By mid-July, Army Group Center had reached the Smolensk area. It had won another massive encirclement, more than 300,000 Soviet prisoners. On paper, this was a triumph. And in reality, it was the moment when the contradictions became operational problems, because the Red Army was not destroying itself by standing still and being encircled. It was trading space for time. It was absorbing losses and reconstituting. And it was doing something the German planners had not fully anticipated. It was concentrating fresh forces, not just defending with what was already there, but bringing up reserves from the east, from the interior, from beyond the reach of German reconnaissance. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. It was adapting. And adaptation was the one thing the German plan could not accommodate, because the plan was built around the assumption that adaptation would not be necessary, that the enemy would not have the time or the organizational capacity to adapt. And then, in August, the contradiction became a crisis. Jaime Group Center's armored spearheads, led by Guderian's Panzer Group and Hoth's Panzer Group, were positioned roughly 200 miles west of Moscow. The road ahead was open. The Soviet defenses in front of Moscow were not yet fully organized. The panzer commanders wanted to drive east, to take Moscow before the autumn rains, before the winter, before the Soviet defenses could solidify. This was the logic of the Schwerpunkt. Concentrate at the decisive point. Strike now. Hitler said no. Or rather, Hitler said not yet. He ordered Guderian's panzers to turn south, to support Army Group South's advance into Ukraine. The reasoning was economic. The resources of Ukraine were needed. The Soviet forces in the Kiev area threatened the southern flank. The encirclement at Kiev would destroy another large Soviet army group, and it would secure the economic objectives that were, in Hitler's mind, at least as important as Moscow. The generals protested. Halder protested. Guderian flew to Hitler's headquarters to argue the case for Moscow. The argument was not merely tactical, it was strategic. The generals believed that Moscow was the key, that taking Moscow would sever the rail network, paralyze command, and force the destruction of the main Soviet force. They believed that the southern objective, however economically attractive, was as a diversion from the decisive blow. Hitler's response was revealing. He did not dispute the military logic. He acknowledged that Moscow was important, but he insisted that the economic objective was not secondary. It was primary, because without the resources of Ukraine and eventually the Caucasus, Germany could not sustain the war, could not feed its armies, could not fuel its vehicles, could not maintain the industrial production needed to fight Britain and potentially the United States. The war was not just a military contest, it was an economic contest. And the economic contest required the South. This was not irrational. This was not madness. This was a genuine strategic calculation. And it was incompatible with the military calculation that said Moscow had to be taken now, in the autumn of 1941, before the window closed. Both calculations were correct within their own frameworks, and the frameworks were mutually exclusive. Guderian turned south. The encirclement at Kiev, completed in late September, was the largest encirclement in military history. More than 600,000 Soviet prisoners, a staggering tactical victory. And it was also the moment when the campaign's timeline broke beyond repair. Because while the panzers were fighting at Kiev, the weeks passed, the autumn rains began, the roads turned to mud, and when Guderian's panzers finally turned back toward Moscow in October, the conditions had changed fundamentally. The delay was not just a matter of days, it was a matter of weeks, and in a campaign whose entire logic depended on speed, weeks were fatal. The Soviet defenses around Moscow, which had been thin and disorganized in August, were now deep, prepared, and reinforced. Fresh divisions had arrived from the east, including forces transferred from the Far East after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack. The weather was deteriorating, the supply situation was worsening, and the panzer divisions, which had been fighting continuously since June, were exhausted and worn down. The advance on Moscow, when it finally came in October and November, was a different operation from the one that would have been possible in August. It was slower. It was more costly. It was fighting against prepared defenses rather than disorganized retreat. And it was fighting against time, against weather, against logistics that were already at their limit. But the contradiction did not stop there. While Army Group Center was being diverted south, Army Group North was struggling toward Leningrad. And it was struggling because the terrain was terrible, because the supply lines were overextended, because the armored formations had been thinned to support the center and south, and because the Soviet defenses in the Leningrad area were tenacious. The city was not taken, it was besieged, and a siege was not what the plan called for. The plan called for the destruction of the city and its capture. Instead, Army Group North settled into a static siege that would last more than 2 years and consume resources without achieving the strategic objective. And in the south, after Kiev, Army Group South continued its advance toward the Donetsk Basin and ultimately toward the Caucasus. But the advance was slowing. The supply lines were now hundreds of miles long. The railheads were far behind. The roads were deteriorating. The autumn rains made movement nearly impossible in some areas, and the enemy was not collapsing. The enemy was retreating, fighting, reconstituting, and bringing up reserves. By November, the entire front was slowing. The three army groups had advanced enormous distances, but they had not achieved their objectives. Leningrad was besieged, but not taken. Moscow was threatened, but not captured. The south was advancing, but the Caucasus was still hundreds of miles away, and the campaign was now 5 months old. 5 months, in a plan designed for 6 to 10 weeks. The logistics situation was dire. This is not an exaggeration. The German supply system was breaking down. The rail network in the occupied Soviet Union was being converted to German gauge, but slowly. The roads were impassable in mud season. The horse-drawn transport, which made up the majority of German logistics, was dying. Horses were starving, vehicles were breaking down and could not be repaired. Fuel was running short, ammunition was running short. Winter clothing had not been issued in sufficient quantities because the plan assumed the campaign would be over before winter. Winter clothing. Think about that for a moment. The German military, planning the largest invasion in history, did not issue adequate winter clothing to its troops, not because they were incompetent, not because they forgot, because the plan said the campaign would be over before winter arrived. The assumption was built into the logistics, the assumption was built into the timeline, and the assumption was wrong. And millions of men were now fighting in temperatures dropping to 30, 40 below zero, in uniforms designed for autumn in Central Europe. The human cost of this miscalculation was enormous. Frostbite casualties in November and December of 1941 ran into the tens of thousands. Not killed, frostbite. Men losing fingers, toes, feet. Men unable to operate weapons because their hands were frozen. Men unable to walk because their boots, designed for the roads of France, offered no protection against the Russian winter. And these were not abstract statistics. These were individual men in individual foxholes, in individual moments of suffering, paying the price for a planning assumption made in a warm office in Berlin. And yet the advance continued because stopping was not an option that the command structure could easily process. The momentum of the operation, the investment of resources, the political commitment, the fear of what stopping would mean for morale and for the broader strategic situation, all of these factors pushed the armies forward even as the conditions made forward movement increasingly impossible. The Soviet counteroffensive began on the 5th of December 1941. Fresh divisions, well-equipped for winter, struck the overextended German lines in front of Moscow. The effect was immediate and devastating. The German advance, already faltering, was thrown back. In some sectors, the retreat was chaotic. Units were encircled. Supply lines were cut. The myth of German invincibility, which had sustained the Wehrmacht since Poland, cracked. And here is the thing that makes the contradiction truly visible. The Soviet counteroffensive was not a surprise. German intelligence had reported the buildup of Soviet reserves, the conditions that made the counteroffensive possible, the exhaustion of German forces, the overextension of supply lines, the arrival of winter, were all predictable. They were all consequences of the original plan's assumptions. The plan had assumed a 6 to 10 week campaign. The campaign was now in its 6th month.
The plan had assumed the Red Army would be destroyed west of the Dnieper line. The Red Army had absorbed enormous losses and kept fighting. The plan had assumed 3 objectives could be pursued simultaneously. The resources to pursue them simultaneously did not exist. Every failure of the winter of 1941 was traceable back to a contradiction embedded in the plan. Not a failure of execution, not a failure of courage, not a failure of tactical skill, a failure of strategic coherence. The plan asked the army to do 3 things at once, in a space too large, in a time too short, with resources too thin, against an enemy too large and too resilient, in service of objectives that could not be achieved simultaneously. The generals blamed Hitler, and they were not entirely wrong.
Hitler's insistence on the southern objective, his refusal to designate Moscow as the sole Schwerpunkt, his interference in operational decisions, all contributed to the dispersal of effort. But the generals had also failed. They had not forced the choice. They had not insisted on a single axis. They had accepted the 3 objective structure because it reflected Hitler's political priorities, and they had told themselves that the Soviet collapse would make the choice unnecessary. They had shared the assumption. They had built the logistics around the assumption. They had planned the campaign around the assumption. And when the assumption failed, the contradictions that the assumption had papered over became visible all at once. There is a deeper layer to this, too, a layer that goes beyond military planning into the nature of the German war effort itself. Barbarossa was not just a military operation. It was an ideological project. The invasion of the Soviet Union was framed, from the beginning, as a war of annihilation. Not just a war to defeat an army or seize territory, but a war to destroy a political system, a racial enemy, an ideological construct, the Kommissar Order, which directed the execution of captured political officers, the Einsatzgruppen, the killing units that followed the army, the Hunger Plan, which explicitly contemplated the starvation of millions of Soviet civilians to feed the German army and the German home front. These were not aberrations. They were part of the plan, and they created additional contradictions. Because a war of annihilation is harder to wage than a war of conquest, it requires more resources. It requires more brutality.
It eliminates the possibility of political accommodation with the conquered population, and it creates enemies where pragmatism might have created neutrals
or even allies. In the early weeks of the invasion, in some parts of Ukraine and the Baltic states, German forces were greeted by populations who had suffered under Soviet rule. There was, briefly, a possibility of leveraging local resentment against the Soviet system. But the racial ideology that underpinned the German war effort made this impossible. The populations of the East were, in the Nazi framework, untermenschen, subhumans. They were not potential allies. They were not even potential subjects. They were obstacles, or resources, or targets. And this ideological framework guaranteed that the occupation would be brutal, that resistance would grow, and that the military effort would have to contend not only with the Red Army, but with an increasingly hostile population across a vast occupied territory. The contradiction here is stark. The military plan required rapid advance and minimal friction. The ideological plan required a level of brutality that generated friction. The economic plan required the exploitation of occupied territory. The racial plan required the destruction or enslavement of the people who lived in that territory and who would have been necessary to make it productive. You cannot simultaneously exploit a region's agriculture and starve its farmers. You cannot simultaneously secure a region militarily and terrorize its population into resistance. You cannot simultaneously need the cooperation of local administrators and murder them as racial inferiors. These contradictions were not theoretical. They played out in the occupied territories throughout 1941 and beyond, and they imposed a military cost. The security divisions, the rear area troops, the resources devoted to anti-partisan operations, all of these were resources that could have been used at the front, and they grew over time as the brutality of the occupation generated more resistance, which required more repression, which generated more resistance, a spiral that consumed resources without producing security. By the spring of 1942, the campaign had to be redesigned. The original plan was dead. The three objectives had not been achieved. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. The Red Army, battered beyond anything the Germans had anticipated, still existed, still fought, still counterattacked. And the German army, which had suffered more than 1 million casualties in the first year, could not replace those losses at the rate required. The redesign was Case Blue, the summer offensive of 1942, and it repeated the contradiction. It aimed at the Caucasus oil fields and at Stalingrad simultaneously. Two objectives, two axes. Again, the forces were divided. Again, the advance overextended. Again, the logistics could not sustain the ambition. And again, the result was disaster. Stalingrad became the graveyard of the Sixth Army, and the Caucasus objective was never achieved. The pattern had been set in 1941. The contradictions embedded in Barbarossa were not corrected. They were inherited. They were reproduced. They were amplified, selected, and the fundamental problem, the incompatibility of the objectives, was never resolved. It could not be resolved without abandoning the ideological framework that produced the objectives. And the ideological framework could not be abandoned without abandoning the political foundation of the regime. This is the deepest contradiction. Not a military one, not a logistical one, a political one. The war could not be won as it was designed, but it could not be redesigned without changing the nature of the regime that was fighting it. And the regime could not change its nature, so the contradictions persisted, and the war continued, and the cost mounted. And the end, when it came, was not the quick victory of the 6 to 10 week plan. It was 4 years of grinding attrition across a continent, ending in the ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945. Historians have debated the counterfactuals endlessly. What if Hitler had allowed the drive on Moscow in August? What if the three objectives had been sequenced rather than simultaneous? What if the ideological framework had been moderated to allow political cooperation with anti-Soviet populations? What if the campaign had been delayed by a year to allow more logistical preparation? These questions are interesting, but ultimately misleading, because they assume that the contradictions were accidental, that a different decision here or there would have resolved them. The evidence suggests otherwise. The contradictions were structural. They arose from the nature of the objectives themselves. They arose from the ideological framework that produced those objectives. They arose from the political system that made certain choices impossible. And they arose from the fundamental mismatch between Germany's resources and the scale of the task it had set itself. No single decision could have fixed Barbarossa. Not the diversion to Kiev, not the failure to take Moscow, not the siege of Leningrad. These were symptoms. The disease was in the plan itself, in the assumption that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure, in the belief that three incompatible objectives could be achieved simultaneously by a force that was insufficient for any one of them, in the conviction that ideological certainty could substitute for strategic coherence. The men who planned Barbarossa were not fools. Halder was a professional of the first rank. The army group commanders, Bock, Lieb, Rundstedt, were experienced soldiers. The panzer commanders, Guderian, Hoth, Kleist, were among the most talented operational commanders of the 20th century. They understood the problems. They raised objections. They pointed out the risks. But they operated within a system that made certain objections impossible to sustain. A system in which the political leadership's ideological commitments overrode military logic. A system in which questioning the fundamental assumptions was not merely professionally risky, but politically dangerous. And they also shared the assumptions. This is important. They were not simply obeying orders against their better judgment. Many of them genuinely believed that the Soviet Union would collapse. They had seen France fall. They had seen Poland fall. They had seen the apparent brittleness of authoritarian systems when subjected to military shock. They believed that the Soviet system was more brittle than the others, and they were wrong. But their error was not stupidity. It was the application of a recent lesson to a fundamentally different situation. It was the failure to recognize that the Soviet Union's size, its population, its industrial depth, its political structure, and its willingness to absorb catastrophic losses made it a different kind of enemy from any that Germany had previously faced. The Soviet Union did not fight like France. It did not fight like Poland. It absorbed blows that would have destroyed any other army and kept fighting. It lost millions of soldiers in the first months and kept fielding divisions. It lost its most productive agricultural and industrial regions and kept producing weapons. It lost territory measured in hundreds of thousands of square miles and kept resisting. And it did all of this while simultaneously evacuating industry eastward, reorganizing its command structure, learning from its mistakes, and building the military force that would eventually carry the red flag to Berlin. None of this was predictable in the detail, but the possibility of it was predictable. The possibility that the Soviet Union would not collapse in 6 weeks was knowable. The possibility that a continental campaign could not be sustained on the logistics system that Germany possessed was knowable. The possibility that 3 diverging axes of advance would overextend and exhaust the attacking force was knowable. The possibility that winter would arrive and the campaign would not be over was knowable. It was all knowable. And in various ways, various people knew it. The logistics officers knew it. The intelligence officers who assessed Soviet reserves knew it. The commanders who looked at the map and saw the 3 arrows diverging knew it. But knowing it and acting on it were different things. Acting on it required saying that the plan could not work, that the objectives had to be reduced, that the timeline had to be extended, that the resources were insufficient, and saying those things meant confronting the political leadership with conclusions it did not want to hear. The final irony is this: the very qualities that made the German military so effective in 1939 and 1940, speed, audacity, concentration, the willingness to accept risk, the expectation of quick decision, became liabilities in 1941. The system was optimized for short, sharp campaigns against enemies that would break under pressure. It was not optimized for a continental war of attrition against an enemy that would not break. And the transition from one kind of war to the other was not made, could not be made, because making it would have required acknowledging that the quick victory model had limits, and the entire strategic logic of the German war effort was built on the premise that those limits did not exist. Barbarossa was not a failure of execution. It was not a failure of courage. It was not a failure of tactical skill. It was a failure of strategic coherence. A failure born from the attempt to pursue incompatible objectives simultaneously, in a space too large, in a time too short, with resources too thin, against an enemy too resilient, in service of an ideology that made rational adaptation impossible. The contradictions were not hidden. They were visible from the beginning. They were visible in the directive. They were visible in the geometry of the advance. They were visible in the logistics calculations. They were visible in the war games. And they were visible in the simple fact that 3 arrows pointing in 3 different directions cannot concentrate at a single decisive point. The men who played Barbarossa understood this. Some of them, in their quiet moments, in their private doubts, in the objections they raised and then withdrew, they understood that the plan asked too much of too few, across too great a distance in too short a time. But they proceeded, because the alternative was to say no. And saying no in that system, in that political context, in the shadow of a dictator who had just achieved the most spectacular military victories in European history, was not a simple thing. And so the contradictions went to war, and the contradictions lost. And millions of people, soldiers and civilians on all sides, paid the price of a plan that was at war with itself before it was at war with the enemy. If this kind of investigation into how strategy unravels from the inside is the kind of history you want to keep finding, the channel will be here.